Hello, how's it going? It is Saturday, November 12th, 2022, and we're still in the war. By the way, tonight on the Roundtable channel, the link is on the homepage of this channel. I'm doing a roundtable with three really great guests on a really interesting topic. We're going to be talking exclusively about the Donbass situation with Lou Sivaya, Mike Jones, who's I. Earl Grey, and Wyatt Reed. Now, Lou and Wyatt are journalists, and Mike from I. Earl Grey is traveling right now, and he's actually gotten to the Donbass, and they're reporting on the ground in the Donbass. I'm going to have them on. It's at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, which is just in a couple of hours from now. So I hope you can check them out. And I think it's going to be a great broadcast. Yeah. So anyway, right. Are we going to freeze the conflict, or are we going to keep on trucking? See, for those of you who don't know, the Russians went into Syria in 2015. And what they did was that they supported the Assad regime very successfully. And they got to a point where the country is, in essence, kind of partitioned. And the Russians were the ones who froze the conflict there. Because Putin is very good, very adept at the concept of freezing a conflict so that, there might be a war in some region and it just sort of like stops and nothing really much happens. I mean, a few random attacks here and there, but the conflict in itself is sort of like static. And static for years, okay? Because, Putin and the Kremlin generally, they're very smart at realizing when they have to sort of like, cool down the conflict and just keep it there on the back burner until, eventually they decide to bring it to the front burner. Now, a lot of people now are thinking that the Russians are going to freeze the conflict. Or, let me rephrase that. There are a lot of people who would like the Russians to freeze the conflict. But to my way of thinking about the situation, they misunderstand the picture here. See, because the Putin and the Russians, the Kremlin, they already froze the Ukraine conflict between 2015, when the Minsk II agreement was signed, until 2022. They froze it for 7 years. Now, why do you freeze a conflict? Well, because of course you want to sort of like freeze it so that other things can happen that might be to your benefit or to avoid things that might be to your detriment. And let just time pass, but without any real resolution to the conflict. And so a lot of people, now that the Russians have given up the right bank of the Dnieper River around Kherson, right, and they gave up Kherson city. Mm-hmm. They evacuated their troops and all the civilians there, and they gave up that territory. It wasn't a Ukrainian victory. Don't let them confuse you. There was no Ukrainian victory. I mean, what do you call it when you come in and occupy an empty territory when the former force that was holding it evacuated? Is that a victory? No, it's not. And to call it a surrender, that's not correct either. But anyway, the point is that, with this advance, let's put it that way, this advance of the Zelensky regime forces into this area of Kherson, which is now Russian territory, at least so far as the Russians believe it is, well, they're taking it as this victory, and some elements in the Zelensky regime want to, keep on attacking as if they actually won anything, which they didn't. And others, more sensible perhaps, are trying to freeze the conflict so that the Russians have this sliver of land that they've captured, the south and east of Ukraine that they've captured and they're holding. Mm-hmm. And they're hoping to freeze the conflict. And curiously enough, a lot of Russians, or Russian commentators, are sort of like hysterical about the possibility of this freezing. And a lot of Zelensky regime propaganda, especially in the Russian sphere, is trying to tell people, the Russians are losing, they can't hold anything, it's better to freeze the conflict. Mm-hmm. Well, my thinking is that this is not a freeze in the conflict at all. Basically, and it seems very clear to me, if you look at a map, that what Surovikin, the commanding general of this conflict, and behind him the Kremlin, because of course this authorization to do this, of this withdrawal, the approval of it was given by the Ministry of Defense, i.e. the Kremlin. Now, it's very clear if you look at a map that the way the Russians evacuated that area puts them in a much better position defensively to sort of like wait out the next few weeks. Because you have to keep in mind, again, geography. Right now, we're in the end of the fall period. A lot of rain, and the ground gets muddy, very muddy. It's complicated to do maneuver warfare in these conditions, okay? Your vehicles get sucked in by that mud. It's happening to both sides. So it seems to me that what the Russians are really doing is that they're getting their ducks in a row to launch a major offensive. See, why would the Russians want to freeze the conflict? Well, they would want to freeze it if they don't have the men and the weaponry and the equipment to continue fighting. But they do have the men and the equipment. They just did a call-up of supposedly 300,000 men. I personally think it was much more, but that's for another video. They did a call-up of 300,000 men. And already at the front, the first 50,000 of those troops are in the area that the Russians hold of formerly Ukraine territory. So the Russians have no need to sort of like freeze the conflict in order to get more men and equipment. Now, on the flip side, if they freeze the conflict, that would give the Zelensky regime a chance to get a lot of men and equipment from the West. Would the Russians want that? Of course not. So, to the Russians, there's no benefit to freezing the conflict at this time. And there's a lot of detriment to freezing the conflict insofar as allowing NATO troops, NATO weaponry to flood into Ukraine from the West. And that's part of the whole reason that General Surovikin is blowing up the entire electrical grid of Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine. It's not that he's doing it as a punitive measure against the civilians. He wants to shut down the trains because the trains are electric. The vast majority, I think it's 90% of the trains are electric. And so with no electricity, no trains. No trains means you can't move in men and gear from the West. So Surovikin has pulled back to the Dnieper River, and the Dnieper River is extremely wide at this area of Kherson. And so it's a natural barrier. It's easily defensible. And so he can move his troops around to get ready for a big offensive while pounding the electrical system to ensure that no more weapons come from the West, from NATO. Now, of course, there will come a time when the Zelensky regime forces and their NATO masters will figure out how to overcome this problem of the broken train system. And so, of course, this pause that we're going to be experiencing over the next couple of weeks, it's only going to be that, just a couple of weeks, until the ground hardens. And the ground hardens when it gets cold enough. When it gets, at a steady -1, -2 degrees Celsius. And so it seems pretty funny to me to hear all of this talk of freezing the conflict. This is just a pause, an operational pause. And the real fireworks are going to start right after this. Because you got to keep in mind, the Zelensky regime, they're out of gas. Out of gas literally and metaphorically. They've run out of men. It's credibly estimated that something like 110 to 130,000 men of the Zelensky regime have been killed, and probably 1.5 times that number wounded, incapacitated. And so, the original army that the Zelensky regime had back in February of this year, it's gone. And the equipment, well, it's also gone. And so, why are the Russians pausing? Because they're getting their ducks in a row. This is not a freeze in the conflict, or I would be very, very surprised if it were, and only time will tell, quite frankly. But it seems to me that this is just an operational pause to let the weather do its work of hardening the ground, while at the same time gathering all the men and all the weaponry to make a full-on blowout offensive. Do keep in mind, in other areas of the front, the Russians are continuing their grinding, slow, methodical advance. They're coming close to capturing Solidar, and after that, it's Kramatorsk. You know, it's this grinding approach in the east. Slow and steady wins the race, which has been extremely effective for the Russians throughout this conflict. It's been extremely effective because they've lost few men, and they've inflicted punishing damage. Now, what's interesting is that, the last time the Russians evacuated an area, like they pulled back in Kharkov, in the Kharkov region where I am now, they pulled back out of that area, and the Ukrainians swarmed in, and they got annihilated. They got hit hard, because all that territory that they advanced into that was empty, well, it had been pre-sighted. And the Russians just went to town on them, okay? And there are a lot of people, like in Ukraine intelligence, the French intelligence, they think that the Kherson withdrawal is also kind of like a trap of pulling in, creating a vacuum to pull in the Zelensky regime forces so that the Russians can just go to town on them there again, like they did back in Kharkov in September. Maybe, maybe not. That's not really the issue. The issue is that the Russians want to have a defensive line that is as easy to control as possible and have options. Because do keep in mind, the area that they controlled in Kherson, to the north of the river, that is on the right bank, the area that they evacuated, it was extremely hard to defend because it's just flat open steppe. And it was getting muddy and mucky. And doing anything in that kind of territory is a bit of a nightmare. I mean, if you've ever trundled through a field in late winter, it's cold, it's wet, and the mud is just quicksand. So the Russians seem to be doing this operational pause, but it's not a freezing of the conflict. But it seems to me that a lot of people in the West would like this conflict to be frozen now. They want to freeze it because they see the scorecard insofar as the losses of the Zelensky regime, the losses of equipment of the Zelensky regime, and the fact that the NATO allies, they're running out of gear. They don't have any more gear to give. And they're sending, a few nicks and knacks, a few things here and there, but it's not enough. Because the Ukraine conflict has just been this just huge suck of equipment. So anyway, my thinking at this time is that this is not freezing the conflict. This is just an operational pause. That'll last, like I said, 2 to perhaps as many as 5-6 weeks even. And again, it'll depend strictly on the ground, how frozen it gets. But once it's good and frozen, which will certainly happen by, say, mid to late December, that's when the Russians are going to move. That's when they're going to make their real move. And everything that is happening between now and then is just preparation for that. Notice, too, something really interesting. See, between the announcement that they were pulling out of Kherson and the Russians actually pulling out of Kherson, it was 3 days. And what does that tell you? They'd made up their mind about this a few weeks ago. Probably the instant that Surovikin took command, that was probably one of his first orders of business, getting everything ready to pull out. And a lot of commentators have noted that a lot of the defensive positions that the Russians built up in Kherson, which they and I myself thought meant that the Russians were going to hold on to Kherson no matter what. No, it turned out that those defensive positions were perfect for a withdrawing army, to protect a withdrawing army. And so that seems to have happened. It seems to have happened weeks ago, the decision. And it was just announced this last Tuesday, and here we are on Saturday, and it turns out that by Friday, All the Russians were gone, as well as all the civilians. Now, of course, over the next few days, we're going to hear about Russian atrocities. That's bullshit. The Russian atrocities that the Zelensky regime is going to discover, it's stuff that the Zelensky regime themselves did. Retaliation against anybody in Kherson that they catch who they suspect might have helped the Russians. I'm sure that the people who actually helped the Russians are long gone. They evacuated with the civilians back a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, those people are long gone. And the people that the Zelensky regime is going to claim are the victims of Russian atrocities, those are going to be nobodies. People that, out of vindictiveness and a desire for revenge, will be targeted by the Zelensky regime. Because remember who they are. Never forget who they are. They're pigs. They are. The Zelensky regime and his whole coterie of people, they're pigs. But that's for another video. The point I want to make in this one is that the Russians are not going to freeze this conflict because ultimately this is an existential war for them. It was perfectly fine to freeze the conflict in Georgia, perfectly fine to freeze the conflict in Syria. Syria, in particular, it's not existential to the Russians. They're an important ally of the Russians, but it's not the continued existence of the Russian state. And neither, for that matter, is Georgia. Georgia is small. Georgia is not the big kahuna here, but Ukraine is. And so the Russians, they're not going to freeze anything. It's just this pause. And all the people who, on the one side, who are pro-Russian, who are getting hysterical, and the people on the NATO side who are going like crazy with glee, they're both completely wrong. And this is why you should never let your emotions take over. Surovikin, to my mind, is proving himself to be a real master, because the emotional drive to hold on to territory that you captured is enormous. But you have to think of what is best for your army. And Surovikin decided, this territory, we're holding it, but we're going to have to defend it. It's going to be a hassle. We might get into all kinds of trouble, lose all kinds of men. Do we really want that? Well, if we just give it up, go to behind the river, where we'll be protected by the river, and we'll be able to do a lot of other very interesting things, who cares about empty cow country? Who cares about the city of Kherson that is empty? Who cares? He was using his head. You should do the same. Take it easy.